Welcome to Business Talk on businesstech.co.za. If you've spent any time around the financial services industry lately, you'll know that fintech has certainly moved from being the belle of the ball, where it was constantly looked at to come to the dance, but never really asked to finally being that niche disruption to the kind of operating system when you look at modern finance. So it certainly came through in the budget recently. There was lots there to be very excited for fintech. And I think across Africa, we're seeing an extraordinary wave of innovation from digital banks, mobile payments, we've got open banking infrastructure. But behind all of that is a big question. Who's building all of this? Because the real constraint on Africa's fintech revolution might not be capital or technology or even regulation. I think it could be the skills and the talent pipeline, the developers, the data scientists, even the AI specialists. So to explore that, I'm joined by Pivendren Naik, who's a tech lead at Sanlam Fintech and CIO, and someone I'm sure who really thinks quite deeply about this particular issue. Pivendren, welcome to the show.
Thank
And,
you.
and from where you sit inside a large financial services group building fintech capability, you've got a really interesting lens and view to bring to bear on this. How real is this wave, and how transformative could it be for Africa's financial systems over the next decade?
Yeah, no, it's super real. And if we go back a couple of years, when I started my career in this space, it's very evident that we are in a transition. In that, go back 5, 10 years ago, the primary focus was access. Right? It's like, how do we get access over to our customers? And then following that, it was giving our customers options, and that's broadly there now. In that, lots of folks have access to the wide spectrum that fintech is. Right? It covers everything from insurance to payments to banking. The access is there, but the question comes in is like whether or not those customer needs are being served. Right? Is the customer getting the best out of this? So to what you were saying is we are very much transitioning from having those interfaces and having those access to now better serving the customer for their particular need. And that comes with a different set of problems, because if the access is the first step, now we're sort of transitioning to the second step and starting sort of this model of sprinting to very specific needs. And we've got to start building and thinking about the flexibility in how we think about these things. Very different mental models.
Yeah, absolutely. And use a cricketing analogy. It's like we're through that early part of the innings, and we've got through the new ball a little bit, but it's now how do you consolidate? How do you build? Where fintech becomes the default way that financial services are delivered. And I think one of the fascinating things about fintech is that it's not just about creating new products; it's actually creating entirely new career paths out there. Over the last 5 years, how have the talent requirements inside fintech organizations evolved?
Yep. A lot of it has transitioned from and I'm going to anchor on the first statement that we made of access. Is it's that's the experience layer, right? We've provided the access, we've got the experience layer. The transition of the requirement and talent now is to actually go one step deeper, because we've provided this lovely experience and product layer for customers, but a lot of that is still it's very nice packaging on a lot of technical debt and legacy platforms. Um, it's the unwinding and interconnecting and creating that interop layer that the network is its term I like to use. That becomes now the true unlock, because once you start doing that, you unlock efficiency, you unlock speed, cost reduction, better overall customer experience.
And we saw, interestingly, you talk about building on legacy systems and layers, that what moved markets recently when Claude came out with that blog post saying what we can do with Claude Code now, going into COBOL legacy systems, which used to take teams of coders years almost, we can now do in a couple of quarters. So, I mean, even as we're talking, this thing is evolving. So, what are the roles today that simply didn't exist in financial services maybe even 10 years ago?
And that's a very applicable one to even us here, because often we might feel disconnected from what folks are doing in Silicon Valley and the global stage, and be like, like that's a global problem. That's not a South African problem. But that exact article talking to mainframes is very much a South African problem, and especially in the fintech space, we're still grappling with the transition from mainframes to cloud native computing, um, and things like AI, Claude, OpenAI, and so on, accelerate that, in that it helps us with the very top layer of this problem. But the part that's missing is the understanding of the nuance, the why, the history of this legacy um, platforms that we have, and how we transition um, into the ideal future.
So, given that, what are the skills that you think will become essential in fintech over the next decade as AI and cloud and automation mature? Because what I worry about is it's like AI is hollowing out a lot of the entry level work that coders might have been doing, and that's often where you acquire the why and the nous and understand these things, and then you move up. So, what are the skills that are going to be absolutely critical as we face this wave of disruption?
And I do think that is the fundamental disconnect that we're currently struggling with, in that that there's a lot of hype around AI, and it does solve a lot of problems, but I do think um, we are struggling to grapple with that. It gets us started a lot quicker. It doesn't take us all the way to the finish line. Um, and that work now becomes a lot more difficult to surface in terms of complexity, because it's so easy to get going with all these tools. It's easy to get writing some code and then something partially working, but polishing a solution still requires deep technical expertise. And potentially we are underserving, new entrants into the job market, because they don't get that nice ramp anymore, in that the getting started part is super easy, and then you go from getting started to the deep end. And that's where I truly believe we need to focus, is in, like, how do we expose people to the deep ends of, like, the real world, and all the intricacies of these platforms, without these looking like 1,000-foot challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't see anyone vibe coding an enterprise level SAP solution, for example. And yet, you look at the way some of the market has reacted recently with the SaaS apocalypse, software as a service apocalypse, if no one's ever heard of the acronym. There's so many out there at the moment, but there does seem to be this existential grappling, and where do we go from here, because things are moving so quickly. So I guess it brings us to what we do then, which is the education system challenge, and it's probably the most important bottleneck, because if the industry needs the skills, they have to be produced somewhere, and if you've got that gap from entry level into the deep end, what changes do you believe are most urgently needed in our education system, so we're preparing our young people for these careers?
Yeah, I truly believe that the feedback loop needs to get tighter, right? In that the traditional model of me sitting at university for 3 to 4 years, learning sort of the starting stuff, like the entry level foundational work, has to be better balanced with practical application. Because at the pace the industry is moving, those 4 years that you spend on learning the foundations, lots of folks right now, and I've interacted with a few people, are actually choosing the alternate, in that, like, they know that I can think about a problem, I can go straight to one of these models and get started. I can prototype something, I can get 80% of the way there without investing the 4 years up front on foundation. Um, so it's how we um, expose our new entrants to both these perspectives at the same time. And they're here. I don't think this is purely uh, left onto the academic sector. As industry, we've got to come in as well, and expose these students to these problems way earlier in the cycle. Again, I don't think the 4 year traditional cycle is going to cut it going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it amongst my friends, my networks as well, that extremely, you're seeing a truncated version of what we would traditionally see as a 4 or 5 year degree path, where individuals are wanting to get out into the marketplace as quickly as possible. And I think realistically, higher education institutions are going to have to adapt to this and think, well, how do we do it? In terms of collaboration, I know Texit was a big thing, and developing skills. Chatting to who was it? Peter de Villiers, the founder of Clickertel. They're doing a lot of work. They're trying to corral government. Do you see scope for more maybe government private sector collaboration here?
And I'll start with the private sector. Is that there are many large companies doing this right now, and they have been. I would say I'm probably biased in the sense in that this is how I got into my career. Is that I studied very traditional engineering, but there were activities where private sector was coming on university, and they were trying to expose us to things, and that actually, I would say, slingshotted my career in that I started engaging in these hackathons, these boot camps, and I got this practical experience. But those were events that happened once a quarter, maybe at best once a month, and it was this big thing. You'd spend a weekend working on some project. That frequency, that sort of investment early on for talent pipelines becomes a lot more meaningful for the private sector, and then as well as government. In that government needs to help enable and then probably incentivize to some point private sector to invest into these things a bit more, right? Because there's big time commitment, capital outlays to get this, and it's mutually beneficial.
And I also think we need to think about how digital skills are woven into basic education as well. So, from a government perspective, how are we thinking about molding the public sector curriculum? You go to China, for example, and I've heard stories of AI already in grade 1 level. Some kind of AI literacy is being included there. So, we really have to think about how we use it so we're not left behind. I think another challenge we often hear about is that kind of skills to employment gap, because young people may acquire training, but they also struggle to break into the industry. Have you seen any training or development models that successfully bridge that gap between learning digital skills and actually landing a job in fintech?
Yes, I mean, one that I'm pretty fond of, and the folks are not very far from me. I've been to the offices a few times for some of these industry engagement type workshops. We think code, they get students in very early. They like from day one, you're engaging with industry, and I think that's a fantastic model. I've hired many an engineer who's gone through the We Think Code process, and the ramp. In terms of traditionally, especially if you're coming into a big corporate, you'd think you'd give someone sort of 3+ months to ramp up. But someone who's coming out of a model like that, it's often it's weeks to a month. They're already familiar with this process, that they're not having to make the mental model switch of going from purely academic foundational thinking to practical applications.
And what I like about the We Think Code model, I remember visiting them in downtown Johannesburg. It was just outside of Bromfontein. I think it was more towards Bank City, if memory serves me correctly. But their onboarding process and their ability to gamify who's actually got the potential to become a skilled coder. Very often they would take individuals almost off the street who didn't have any formal training, but through the way they'd actually developed their testing, which was not just a typical psychometric test, it was gamified and a very interesting model that could scale. I'm not sure if it did scale, and maybe you can correct me here. Has it scaled enough? And I guess that's the big question here, because I think one of Africa's recurring challenges is we've got great projects, great pilot programs, but they often remain small.
Yes. Yeah, and I truly don't think it has scaled. And I could think of, because if you think of We Think of, that's one example, right? And then maybe I can name a second, a third. Beyond that, not so much. This needs to be sort of the thread that runs throughout our education system, throughout our economy. It can't be these isolated companies trying to solve this.
Yeah, it's got to be a collaborative approach. I couldn't agree with you more. And so let's then end with a bit of forward thinking. Take us up to the mountain, show us the promised land. Imagine a scenario where we get this right, where we close our fintech skills gap within the next 5 years. What would the fintech landscape across the continent look like in that world?
Oh, that would be fascinating. I can give you my ideal, and I do always say, and especially me, I do think humans are bad at predicting the future. What was it in 2015? We were meant to have flying cars. I don't think we got there yet. Uh, but where my dream for this, my passion, and what I'm working towards here is that you move away from these individual businesses and these platforms, and where you have to choose a side as a consumer. Um, it transitions more to a network approach. The same way the internet evolved from a particular use case and it kept expanding to the World Wide Web, this will happen with fintech. There will be networks layered on top of each other. Um, and the true benefit there is that we get to meet the customer where they are for the full spectrum of fintech, right? So that we might have a company specializing in this aspect of fintech versus that aspect, but the customer is none the wiser, right? Customers met where they're at, and through that, we get to go as deep as we need to, focusing on efficiency. Because as you scale, and now that we looking at multipliers in terms of our access, significantly more traffic. Like, look at like the AI problem that we have in that data centers can't scale fast enough for this. I don't think we'll get there for fintech type services. Hopefully, we're not just building data centers in a mad flurry for fintech, but it's a similar problem. And that is all based on efficiency, interoperability, because at the end of the day, I always look at this as, an endless amount of options to the customer without flexibility leaves us in a world of fragmentation. And that's not a world that we want to be in.
Yeah, and it certainly touches at least on the regulatory direction of travel. If you read through the budget, interoperability is a big part of what was in the expanded budget when it comes to how we move forward as an industry. Our payments modernization program, moving BankServe to paying as almost this utility, and then opening up to some of those non-bank players in the space. Ultimately will take us a long way towards realizing that dream, but we need to ensure we've got the talent pipeline filled, because I think that ultimately will determine kind of which regions lead the next phase of our fintech innovation. So, Pivendren Naik, thank you so much for sharing a bit more about how you're thinking about the skills gap and also what that future could look like with us here on Business Talk. Take care.